In this video, I just want to talk a little bit about what you can expect from this course. So this is going to be a comprehensive course on HTML and CSS, and we're going to start from the absolute beginning, starting with HTML5 markup. We'll go through all the basics of CSS to the latest features like Flexbox, CSS Grid, animation, variables, responsive design, and much more. Not only that, you'll also learn Sass in this course, which is a CSS precompiler that extends the syntax of CSS to include things like nesting, inheritance, functions, and more. This course is composed of both learning sections where we'll basically be working in a sandbox to look at certain features, and then we have about a half dozen projects ranging in size, and then some mini projects on top of that. So who is this course actually for? The short answer is everyone. Whether you're an absolute beginner looking to learn how to build websites, how websites work, or a seasoned developer that wants to get better at CSS, Sass, and UI creation in general without having to rely on frameworks like Bootstrap. So sections 1 through 4 are geared more towards beginners as we go over the basics of HTML and CSS. So if you're comfortable with things like HTML5 and CSS topics like font styles, basic alignment, margin and padding, things like that, then feel free to skip these sections and start using Flex, CSS Grid, animation, and Sass. So here's a summary of some of the things that we'll be going over in this course. So we'll start with the basics of how websites work and how the internet works in general in terms of IP addresses, how exactly a website that's stored on a server somewhere else gets displayed in your browser. We'll look at setup and tools. We're using a text editor called VS Code, which is definitely the most popular editor in the web development world, and we'll be using tools such as Emmet. We'll install a couple different extensions as well, get a workflow going. We'll look at HTML5 in terms of just the core basics of tags and attributes. We'll look at all the basic tags. We'll also look at the semantic tags like header, footer, aside, things like that, and show you how to structure a proper HTML5 document. We'll be looking at CSS fundamentals like the box model, font styles, things like that. Responsive design, so media queries, making everything look good on mobile devices, including smartphones and tablets. Every single project we create is going to be responsive. Okay, we'll be looking at Flexbox, CSS Grid, which are ways to align columns and rows. We'll be looking at animation with transitions and keyframes, CSS variables, transforms, pseudo-selectors. We'll be building things like sticky menus, overlays. We'll be styling forms and landing pages. We'll even look at website deployment, so making your website live on the internet using a shared host. We'll also be looking at a platform called Netlify. And then finally, we'll look at Sass, which is a CSS precompiler to allow us to basically extend the functionality of CSS. And we'll create a portfolio project with that. All right, so as I said, this is going to be a mix of learning sections and projects. The learning lectures will include specific topics such as the box model, media queries, and many other things. And then we'll also have 6 good-sized projects along with some other mini projects. So the first website project we'll be building is this hotel website, which is before we even get into Flexbox and the grid and anything like that. We'll be using just basic CSS here, including floats, because I think it's important to learn the basics, even though for the most part you're going to be using Flex or the grid. Next project is this Edge Ledger website, which is a single page site for a financial company. It includes Flexbox, image overlay, sticky menu, things like that. We will be implementing a little bit of JavaScript for smooth scroll. We'll be doing this in a couple projects. However, JavaScript is not the focus of this course. I just want to make that clear. We will be using a little bit of it, but we're not going to really get into JavaScript. This course is more about UI and HTML, CSS, and Sass. So the next project is a news grid site where we use CSS Grid. We use grid template columns, and I show you how to span rows and things like that. Next, we'll build a landing page that uses a hamburger menu. So you guys have probably seen this before. You click it and it opens up a menu. We'll have a big overlay that has the menu items. We'll also animate the hamburger menu itself. Then we have a CSS timeline project where we have different items on the timeline. We're going to add a little bit of JavaScript here to bring the items in from the side as we scroll down. And then the last project is a SaaS project where we create a 4-page portfolio site with a home, about, a work page with some pretty in-depth CSS animations, transitions, and then a contact page. And we're going to deploy this to a platform called Netlify and make the contact page. All right, so before we get started, I feel like it's important that you know at least the basic idea of how the process of getting and loading a web page in your browser works. So for some of you, this may be very simple. You may already know this stuff. For some of you, this may be very confusing and daunting. If it is confusing, just know that you'll understand this process more as time goes on, and you don't need to know it to start building websites. I think a good metaphor for this is that you don't need to know how an engine works to be able to learn how to drive a car. And the stuff that I'm going to talk about here in this section, it all happens under the hood. So if you're a beginner and you're just stepping into this world, don't worry if you don't understand this stuff. I just think it's important to mention before we start. All right, so we all use the internet every day, but most people don't know how it actually works. And they just know they go to, Facebook.com or whatever, and it loads their profile, their social media. So I'm going to try to explain what actually goes on under the hood in very simple terms. Basically, the internet is a global network of computers and devices, and these computers have what's called an IP address to uniquely identify them, just like an actual address for your home. And these IP addresses, they're assigned to you by your internet service providers. And they're usually in the form of 4 numbers with dots in between, just like this here. Now, this is a version 4 IP address. There's also version 6 IP addresses that are much longer. And these were created for when we run out of version 4 IP addresses. And you can actually go to Google and just search "what's my IP," and you'll find different sites that will actually trace it and show it to you if you want to know what your current IP address is. Now, even if you have multiple devices in your home, like let's say you have 2 computers, a tablet, a mobile device, each of these devices, they all have what's called a private IP address that is only local to your network, your home network. Your router, however, has a public IP address, and that's the IP address that the internet actually sees. All the private ones for each device, that's only within your home network or your office network, whatever it may be. All right, now the way that computers talk to each other is over something called the TCP/IP protocol. And a protocol is basically just a way for computers to communicate, almost like a language, so they can speak to each other. Don't worry too much about this. If you're getting into computer networking and stuff like that, it's very important to understand the different network layers and so on, how data packets are sent. But that's not important for what we're doing here, or even to become a web developer. Now, HTTP is a little more important for you to understand. This stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And if you notice, when you type in a website URL like google.com, Facebook, you're usually doing HTTP or HTTPS. HTTPS is for secure connections using an SSL certificate, and we'll talk more about that later. But basically, HTTP is what's called an application layer protocol, and it actually runs over TCP, and it's responsible for handling web traffic between a browser like Google Chrome or Firefox and a web server that stores a website, and we'll talk more about that in the next slide. So HTTP is one of many types of application layer protocols. You also have, for instance, SMTP, which deals with email. You have FTP and SSH. These deal with transferring files over the internet. HTTP, however, is going to be the one you deal with the most in web development. So websites and web pages are basically just files that are stored on computers that run a piece of software called a web server. And an example of a web server would be Apache or Nginx. Don't worry if you've never heard of these before. Technically, you could run a web server from your home on a computer, but most ISPs prohibit doing that, and you probably wouldn't want to do that anyways, because if for some reason the computer shuts off or something happens, your website goes down. So what you usually do is you can build a website on your local machine at your home or office, and then you would upload it to a hosting company, okay, or to a server that a hosting company owns. And there's all different types of hosting accounts. You can actually get a dedicated server, which is an actual computer that's dedicated to you for your use, but those are really expensive. You have shared hosting where you share accounts on one server with other people. This is much cheaper, and I'll go over the different types of hosting in a later section. But that's basically what you're going to do is use a hosting company, and in addition to that, you're going to need a domain name, which can be a .com, .net, .org, and many other TLDs. Now, remember, all computers, including web servers, have an IP address, but it would really suck if you wanted to go to Facebook or Google and you had to remember something like 7522.128.131. So what happens is when you type in, for instance, http://www.facebook.com, there's something called a DNS, or a domain name service, that actually maps that domain to the correct IP address of facebook.com or whatever website you're visiting. And this makes our lives much easier. Otherwise, you'd probably have a notebook with hundreds of numbers for each website that you want to visit. So later on, I'm actually going to show you how to register a domain name and how to upload a website to a web hosting account. All right, so let's take a quick look at a diagram that kind of explains what we've been talking about. So you, the user, down at the bottom, types in, let's say, google.com into a web browser, and this could be Microsoft Edge, Google Chrome, Firefox, Safari, any web browser, and the DNS server looks at the domain name, such as google.com, and it maps it to the IP address that's needed, as you can see right here. Okay, once it gets that IP address, it then makes what's called an HTTP request to the web server of that IP address. And then that web server will return a response with the HTML file that needs to be loaded, any other files, including CSS files, which are used for styling. You have any images that are on the page, those will get sent, and whatever else is needed for google.com to be loaded in your browser. Now, these HTTP requests, they're made when you load a web page as well as when you, for instance, submit a form. Okay, and there's different types of requests, there's different status codes, but that's all stuff you're going to learn later on when you get into scripting and programming. You don't need to know that stuff to create basic static web pages with HTML and CSS.